March 22, 1975. It is early afternoon in northern Alabama, deep inside the Browns Ferry nuclear plant. On the bank of the Tennessee River near the towns of Athens and Decatur, a worker is crouched in a low, cramped room directly beneath the control room. In his hand is a single lit candle. He is holding the flame up toward a wall packed with bundles of electrical cable, watching to see if it bends. He is not checking for danger. He is checking for a draft. It is one of the smallest, most ordinary tools a person can hold, a candle, and it is about to start a fire that pushes a nuclear reactor in Alabama to within 1 hour of melting its own core. The room he is kneeling in is called the cable spreading room. It is the nerve center of the plant, a low concrete space where thousands of control cables fan out and climb up into the reactor controls above. Workers had cut open a sealed opening in the wall to push new cables through, and now they needed to plug the gap again. The seal they were packing it with was polyurethane foam, soft and yellow and highly flammable. To check whether air was still leaking through the temporary patch, the worker did the cheapest thing imaginable. He lit a candle and held it to the hole. The draft pulled the flame sideways, straight into the foam, and the foam caught. The danger that afternoon was never an earthquake, never sabotage, never anything from outside. The danger was a nuclear plant that had threaded the entire nervous system of 2 reactors through a single room, packed that room with flammable foam and flammable cable insulation, and then sent men in to hunt for air leaks with an open flame. Checking for a draft with a candle was faster and cheaper than checking for it the safe way, so that is what was done. This is the fire that almost melted down Alabama. To see how a candle could nearly take down a reactor, you have to understand what the cable spreading room actually was. Browns Ferry was a giant of its era. 3 boiling water reactors run by the Tennessee Valley Authority, each one capable of pouring more than 1 million kilowatts onto the grid. Everything an operator does to a reactor of that kind, every valve he opens, every pump he starts, every gauge he reads, travels as a signal down a cable. At Browns Ferry, the cables for Unit 1 and Unit 2 were bundled together by the thousands and routed through that one shared room beneath the control room, stacked in open metal trays from floor to ceiling. The insulation on those cables would burn. The foam sealing the wall would burn. And the men who built the plant had run the control wiring for 2 separate reactors through the same narrow space side by side where a single fire could reach all of it at once. There were no real fire barriers between the trays. There was no fire suppression system worth the name in that room. The whole design assumed a fire there simply would not happen. Think about what that meant in practice. A boiling water reactor like Unit 1 is not a machine you can walk up to and touch. The operators sit in a control room 1 floor above the cable spreading room, and they run the entire reactor through that floor. When they want to know how much water is over the core, a sensor sends the reading up a cable. When they want to start a cooling pump, the command goes down a cable. Cut the cables and the operators are not just inconvenienced. They are blind and they are mute, standing over a reactor that is still hot, holding controls that no longer connect to anything. Browns Ferry had built every one of those lifelines into the path of a single possible fire. This was not the first time someone had worried about exactly that. The hazard of routing critical cables through shared, unprotected spaces was known across the nuclear industry. Foam sealant of the kind packed into that wall had caught fire during work at other sites. The practice of checking air leaks with a candle flame, inches from combustible material, was a habit on the job, not an accident of one careless man. The plant had been handed a layout where 1 fire in 1 room could blind the operators of 2 reactors at the same time, and the people who designed it had decided that was an acceptable thing to build. Now go back to the early afternoon of March 22nd. The candle flame is drawn into the hole and the foam ignites. The workers see the fire and try to beat it out right there at the wall. They smother it, they jam material into the gap, they think they have it. What they cannot see is that the same draft that bent the candle is now pulling the fire through the wall to the other side, into the reactor building, where it has reached the open cable trays. On their side of the wall, the fire looks small. On the far side, it is climbing into the bundles and running along the cables, feeding on the insulation, spreading out of sight. For a while, the workers at the wall genuinely believe they are winning. They keep attacking the small flames they can see on their side of the foam, and they keep failing to put it out because the real fire is no longer in front of them. It has gone through the wall and turned a corner they cannot follow. Carbon dioxide extinguishers are emptied at it. Dry chemical is thrown at it. The fire keeps eating cable on the reactor side, fed by the very draft they had come down to measure. By the time anyone understands that the fire has crossed into the reactor building, it is loose among the control cables of Unit 1 and Unit 2. Roughly 1,600 cables will be damaged before the day is over, and up in the control room, the operators start to watch their plant go dark in front of them. Lights on the control boards begin to flicker and die. Pumps that should be running shut off on their own. Gauges drop to 0 or freeze. In the space of minutes, the men running Unit 1 lose control of system after system as the cables that carry their commands burn away below them. The emergency core cooling systems, the dedicated equipment whose entire reason to exist is to flood the core with water in a crisis, go dead. On Unit 1, nearly every one of those systems is knocked out. The reactor has been scrammed and shut down. But a reactor that has just been running does not go quiet. It keeps making heat, and that heat keeps boiling away the water that covers the fuel. If you stay with me, this is the hour where Alabama came closest to a disaster the country had never seen on its own soil. With the automatic cooling systems gone, the water level over the Unit 1 core begins to fall. Normally, that water sits about 201 inches above the top of the fuel. The operators watch it drop. 200 inches. 150. 100. The decay heat in the core is boiling off roughly 240 gallons of water every minute, and the systems built to replace it are dead cables on the floor of a burning room. The number on the gauge keeps sliding. It falls all the way down to 43 inches above the core. By the plant's own later accounting, there was about 1 hour left. 1 hour between the water they could see on the gauge and a core starting to stand uncovered in open air, where the fuel would overheat and begin to melt. There was no procedure for this. No manual at Browns Ferry had a chapter on fighting a reactor blind, with the emergency systems burned out and the clock running on the core, so the operators improvised. They went looking for any pump in the plant that could still push water into that reactor, no matter what it had been built for. They found 3. They cracked a relief valve by hand to bleed off pressure so water could get in, because the makeshift pumps they were about to use could not push against the full pressure of the reactor. They pressed the condensate booster pump into service, a pump meant to move water through the plant's steam cycle, not to save a core. And they turned to the control rod drive system pumps, small pumps whose normal job is to nudge the control rods a fraction at a time and force them to feed cooling water into the reactor instead. None of these were emergency cooling systems. None were designed for this. They were simply the equipment whose control cables had not yet burned, and the men in that room bent each one to a purpose it was never built for, because it was that or watch the water keep falling. And by hand, valve by valve, pump by pump, the operators began putting water back over the core faster than the heat could boil it away. The level stopped falling. Slowly it started to climb. The core never uncovered. It came within roughly 1 hour and a few feet of water of doing exactly that. And the only thing standing in the way was a handful of men in a half-dead control room running pumps that were never meant for the job. The cost of that afternoon was not paid in lives. No one died at Browns Ferry that day. It was paid in the nerves of the people who stood in that control room and kept working while the floor of their certainty fell out from under them. One of them was a control room operator named Gary McChristian. As the water dropped and the boards went dark, McChristian later said he never moved more than an arm's length from the control panel, and that he was ready to throw himself onto it and hold on for his life if the building gave way. His supervisor that day, Don South, stood with the crew through the same hours working a plant that had lost its eyes and its ears, not knowing minute to minute whether what they were doing would be enough. These were not soldiers under fire, and they were not victims of an enemy. They were plant workers in rural Alabama who came in for an ordinary shift and ended at keeping a wounded reactor alive with their hands, while a fire they could not reach burned through everything that was supposed to protect them. The fire burned for about 7 hours before it was finally put out, and even then it was beaten only when the crews fell back on plain water hoses, after the gas extinguishers had failed to smother it in the cable trays. It took the crews roughly 15 hours from the start of the day to bring both reactors to a safe, cold shutdown. When it was over, the damage was staggering on paper. Around 1,600 cables had been burned. The control systems of 2 large reactors had been gutted, and yet, on the outside, almost nothing had happened. There was no meltdown. There was no breach of the fuel. There was no significant release of radiation beyond the plant. The towns along the Tennessee River, Athens and Decatur, and the farms in between never knew how close the afternoon had come. That gap between 1,600 burned cables and a core 1 hour from open air on one side and a quiet riverbank with no idea on the other is the whole story of Browns Ferry. The disaster did not arrive. It was held back by improvisation, by men refusing to leave a control board, by luck and how the pumps held up. That was not a stroke of bad fortune that no one could have seen. It was a plant built on the assumption that a fire could never threaten the core, run by a candle held to flammable foam because that was the cheap and easy way to check for a draft. The reactor came within an hour of melting not because the technology failed in some unimaginable way, but because the people who designed and ran it had stacked every safety system the operators needed into one room and left it open to a single flame. The fire changed the rules for every nuclear plant in the country. Within days, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was sending bulletins to other plant operators warning them that combustible foam and open flame leak checks near safety cables had nearly cost the nation a reactor. In the years that followed, the commission rewrote its fire protection standards from the ground up producing the regulations known today as Appendix R, which forced plants to physically separate the cables of redundant safety systems so a single fire could never take both, to install real fire barriers between cable trays, and to stop assuming a fire simply could not reach the core. Brown's Ferry had threaded the lifelines of 2 reactors through one open room. The new rules existed to make sure no plant would ever be allowed to do that again. Nearly every fire rule that protects an American reactor today can be traced back to what one candle did in one room in Alabama. Today, the Browns Ferry nuclear plant is still there, still running on the bank of Wheeler Lake on the Tennessee River, one of the largest nuclear stations in the country, more than 50 years after the fire. Boats still pass it on the water. Drivers still cross the river nearby. The plant had been built and operated on the promise that a fire could never put its core in danger. And for 7 hours on a spring afternoon, a single candle came within an hour of proving that promise a lie. The unsettling part of Brown's Ferry was never that one candle. It was the question of how many other plants in those same years were threading every safety system they had through one unguarded room, trusting that no flame would ever find it, while the people living downstream had no idea the bet was being made at all. If you made it this far, thank you for being here. These stories take a long time to research and put together, and every like, comment, and subscription genuinely helps keep this channel going. If you want more stories like this one, consider subscribing. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.